everybody. I'm really pleased to see such a large group of people attending this event, particularly given the short notice with which it was announced. Let me just make one organisational announcement first of all. I understand there are some signing sheets at the back for students who are attending, who may want to get kind of credit and appropriate recognition from their relevant professors. Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Right. So yes, signing sheets for students at the back. I'd like to welcome all of you here today. Those of you who are here attending in person, and those of you who are attending via Zoom as well. My name is Neil Cooper. I'm the director of the School of Peace and Conflict Studies here at Kent State University, and I'm going to be acting as the moderator for this panel today. As you can see, we've got a high level of interest in this event, and I think that reflects first of all, the horror that people feel at the nature of the Russian invasion and the daily images that we see coming out of Ukraine, which seem to be getting progressively more shocking. But I think it also reflects the momentous nature of the events that we're witnessing. For once, it's not hyperbole to suggest that we are witnessing fundamental shifts in the nature of, firstly, the European security system, but also fundamental shifts in the norms, practices, and power relations that have characterized the post-Cold War international global order. Indeed, I think right now, the tectonic plates of the international system are almost moving on a daily basis right now. And the war, I think, for everybody, has thrown up a series of urgent questions, some fundamental, some that may appear a little more facile, but which I think still influence policy. I don't have the time to list all of them, but I think some key questions that it raises include, how did we get here? What is the likely trajectory of the war? How should governments and international organizations respond? How should individuals, communities, and civil society in the US and elsewhere respond? Should NATO impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine? What are the ethics of standing in solidarity with Ukraine, but refraining from putting troops on the ground or in the air? What kind of sanctions should be imposed on Russia? Will they be effective? And what will be the consequences for Western economies? What are the implications of the war for Taiwan and US-China relations? Why should a war thousands of miles away even matter to Americans worried about jobs and the cost of living at home? What are the implications for energy security and energy policy? Whose media and what media sources can we trust? What are the implications of the war for domestic US politics? What are the implications for the European political and security order specifically, and the global order more generally? And even how likely is it that we might be witnessing World War III in the coming weeks and months? A question not seriously posed since the end of the Cold War over 30 years ago. And I think that final question illustrates the significance of the events that we've seen over the last days, weeks, and months. Fortunately, we have a very eminent and expert panel who can help guide us and help us think through at least the answer to some of those questions, if not necessarily all of them. Firstly, we have Richard Steigman Gaul, who is an associate professor in the Department of History, and he publishes and teaches on the histories of 20th century Europe, the Holocaust, and comparative fascism. He's also the author of The Holy Reich, Nazi Conceptions of Christianity. Richard will be interrogating the claims made by Russia in its attempt to legitimize its invasion. Next, we have Eli Kaul, whose research is focused on post-Soviet security and economy, and who recently defended his dissertation on the security services of Ukraine, and who has also conducted extensive field work in Ukraine over the past 4 years. He's also previously worked for the US Department of State Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and his current research is focused on security and corruption in the former Soviet Union. Eli will be examining the roots of the war and the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Next, we will have Dr. Gabriella Paar-Jakli, who is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science here at Kent State. And her research includes US-EU relations, network governance, and the role of networks in transnational relations. Moreover, prior to joining the university here, Gabriella worked as a policy practitioner in Budapest, Hungary, where she served as an expert facilitating economic and trade relations and pursued diplomatic negotiations between Hungary and various other EU countries. So she's in a brilliant position, therefore, to speak to us and talk to us about the impact of the war on both the European political and security order and Europe's relations with America. Next, we'll have Andrew Barnes, who's an associate professor in the School of Multidisciplinary Social Sciences and Humanities here at Kent State. And his research and teaching interests include post-communist political economies, the politics of international finance, and the coercive underpinnings of free markets. Andrew will be speaking about the political economy of sanctions and the implication of the war in Ukraine for the international system. And finally, but by not finally actually, next on the list we have Dr. Molly Merriman, who is an associate professor in the School of Peace and Conflict Studies here at Kent State, and the research director for Queer Britain, United Kingdom's National LGBTQ plus museum. Her book, Clipped Wings, The Rise and Fall of the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II, is considered a foundational text on the subject. And she's also written about the decorated Ukrainian World War II pilot, Nadezhda Popova. And her work on this issue has appeared in the work of Linda Stein's on the Holocaust heroes, Fierce Females. Molly will be speaking on the question of gender and sexuality that have been raised by the war, including the role of Ukrainian women in past wars and the politics of gender and sexuality in the current war. Each member of the panel will speak for up to about 10 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for both the audience here in the room and those on Zoom to ask questions. For those of you who are Zooming in, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A facility as the presentations progress. For those of you in the room, I assume we will have microphones that we can utilize. We do have microphones that we can utilize, so we'll be bringing those around for you to be able to ask your questions from the room. So without further ado, I think we will begin with our first presenter.
Thank you very much, Neil. And just to remind you all of what Neil mentioned a few minutes ago, if you're a student here, on behalf of the class, we have sign-in sheets by the doorway. Make sure to sign yourself in if you haven't yet. As Neil mentioned, my remit is to offer historical contextualization. I am not a published scholar on Ukrainian history, but I am a published scholar on the history of fascism, as well as 20th century Europe and, as you pointed out, the Holocaust. And for those of you who are aware of Putin's sort of rhetorical arguments on the lead up to the invasion, this is now current time cover, you will know that this question of fascism has been used by Putin to make an argument connecting Ukraine's history during World War II to the present day. So Putin has started his new invasion of Ukraine. Keep in mind, it's been an ongoing war since at least 2014, on two historical premises of particular note. First, that Ukrainians are ethnically, and for that matter nationally, no different from Russians, and that history, in his view, amply demonstrates this. In an effort to revise history to justify his new action, Putin has stated that the Soviet Union, under no one less than Vladimir Lenin, made a mistake by making Ukraine one of the constituent republics of the USSR, as many of you will know, standing for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was intended to be the successor state to the old Tsarist Imperial Russia that fell with the Russian Revolution. The second premise upon which Putin based his invasion is that Ukraine remains a fascist state in need of, quote unquote, denazification. This is a word he actually used last week. And that this invasion is to be understood as part of a larger war against fascism. This second charge is, permit me to suggest, a pretty straightforward perversity. One of the defining features of fascism in its historical epoch between World Wars I and II was to promote the invasion of neighbors in the name of making the nation whole, what scholars of nationalism refer to as irredentism, the idea that as long as part of the national group lives outside of the borders of a state, that gives that state the prerogative to invade those neighbors and incorporate that national group. Putin has, permit me to suggest, been doing precisely this since 2014, first with his invasion of Crimea in the name of its ethnically Russian population, then in the Donbas region of Ukraine. It is also, of course, a perversity given that the current president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, far from being a Nazi, is a Jew whose own family were victims of the Holocaust. On the first charge of there being no difference between Russians and Ukrainians, the reality of Ukrainian identity, nationhood, and history is far from what Putin depicts it to be. The history of Ukrainians as a distinct people goes back arguably centuries. I will now share with you a series of maps that I found online, specifically from Washington Post. And of course, like the origins of any ethnic group or national group, such as Italians or Germans, the lineage of Ukrainian national identity is open to historical interpretation. Ukrainians themselves frequently trace their lineage back to Scandinavian traders and settlers who, over 1,000 years ago, made their way from the Baltic Sea through the marshes and forests of Eastern Europe down toward the area of what is now Ukraine. And I don't know if my cursor works. There it is. You can see in green the contemporary borders of Ukraine, and in the darker shadings, you can see different movements of peoples back in the medieval era. And as you'll notice, back in the 1200s, I'm really giving you ample historical context here. You see a variety of Mongol invasions from Mongolia that, of course, would have a deep impact on the history of Eastern Europe through the centuries. The trade routes shown in particular demonstrate that this area was economically connected not just to the north, but also further south to the Byzantine Empire, at the very bottom of the image here, which was the home of Orthodox Christianity for many centuries. Okay, closer to the mic. Okay. I hope this is more audible. Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, known in the Russian language as Kiev, but in Ukrainian as, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Kyiv, was established in the 9th century and is claimed by Russian nationalists as a cultural center today. Putin has invoked Prince Vladimir more than once when justifying his policy against Ukraine, a prince who in the year 988 AD was baptized by a Byzantine priest, which marked the advent of Orthodox Christianity among the people known then as the Rus. But Mongol invasions beginning in the 13th century diminished Kyiv's footprint and led to the rise of Moscow further to the north, as you can see. Descendants of the Mongols formed their own state along the northern rim of the Black Sea, which would eventually become part of the later Ottoman Empire. So some of you will know that Constantinople, as the second Rome, capital of the Byzantine Empire, would, by the 1400s, be transformed into Istanbul, which would become the capital of a Muslim Ottoman Empire. Moving forward several hundred years, we can see Ukraine being divided here between neighboring empires. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so-called, held on to huge tracts of territory, but what is present-day Ukraine also saw incursions of Hungarians, Cossacks, Russians, and even Swedes. Russia and Poland split much of the territory in the 17th century. Russia's advance would continue into the 18th century during the rule of Catherine the Great, who claimed her domains along the Black Sea constituted Novorossiya, or New Russia, a term revived by the pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine today, and needless to say, by Putin himself. So when we're talking about this area, it's right around here, just above where it calls the Crimean Khanate on the map. This was part of a broader ambition of Catherine the Great's to encroach on the Ottoman Empire, which in the 18th century displayed the first signs of weakening. Poland itself would be partitioned out of existence in the late 18th century. This led to the city of Lviv falling under the rule of the Austrian Empire, which you can see here in light blue. This is important because it was there in the mid-19th century where modern Ukrainian nationalism began to take hold, especially through literary figures, intellectuals of the age. Whereas the Russian and German emperors had a policy of forcing their minority populations to speak Russian or German respectively, the Austrian Empire saw no one linguistic population in the majority and pursued a policy, therefore, of greater tolerance towards different languages. In other words, the Austrian Empire was inherently a multilinguistic empire where no one linguistic group dominated others. This turned Lviv into a safe haven, of Ukrainian language and culture. And if you look at old maps of the area from the 19th century, you'll oftentimes, instead of Ukrainian, see the word Ruthenian to describe the ethnic and linguistic population there. The end of World War I, in which Germany first occupied but then lost Ukraine, saw an independence movement crop up all through the country. So this was the first time when Ukrainian nationalists really felt they had an opportunity to create an independent nation state. The Russian Revolution, of course, transformed the old Tsarist empire into a Marxist Soviet Union, nominally committed to the liberation of all ethnic groups. At the same time, Poland also reconstituted itself and took Lviv and a chunk of what is now Western Ukraine into the borders of Poland. So again, here you see the city now formerly part of the Austrian Empire, now part of Poland. So what you get is a country which is being divided in terms of empires between the Russian, Ottoman, and Austrian empires, and then on the eve of World War, or after the end of World War I, when empires shatter into different states between the USSR, Poland, and to some degree, Czechoslovakia. The country, of course, Ukraine would be one of the key battlegrounds of the Russian Civil War, pitting Bolshevik forces against those loyal to the old Tsarist order. The Bolsheviks eventually won and declared a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Under Lenin, Soviet nationality policy led to the promotion, in fact, of Ukrainian language and culture. Lenin's aim was to keep the different non-Russian peoples inside the USSR, making sure that the country would be more than just a greater Russia and make good on a Marxist claim to liberate oppressed peoples. This part of Soviet history, as I said, has been explicitly criticized by Putin, most recently last week. By contrast, Putin has repeatedly heaped praise on Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, whose years of rule would prove deeply traumatic for Ukrainians. In the name of speeding things up, let me show you a few vital maps. The harshest part of Stalin's rule over Ukraine would be the forced collectivization policies, which led to the deaths of over 3 million Ukrainians in what is known as the Holodomor. And the images here show you what percentage of the population was killed in this famine, whether it was Stalin's intentional policy to kill Ukrainians as Ukrainians or was the result of a terrible job of social engineering. Everyone in the academic community views this as a genocide. To make up for the numbers that were lost, ethnic Russians were then promoted to move into Ukraine and make up the numbers, something of a demographic impact which defines Ukraine to this day. I will just leave the map with the discussion of, very briefly if I may, and I'm sorry I'm running out of time, Neil. We all know, of course, about the history of World War II, or many of us do, and how Ukraine was turned during that war into a massive battle site. And this gets us back to this claim of Putin's that he is denazifying the country. German strategists fantasized of turning Ukraine into a Lebensraum for the so-called Aryan race, the breadbasket of a Nazi empire. Some Ukrainian nationalists cooperated indeed with the time with Nazi authorities, seeing the invasion as a means to achieve their own independence. This was particularly the case in Western Ukraine, which until the end of World War II had no experience of Soviet rule, in fact. And this is where Putin thinks that he can make good on his claim that Ukraine is fascist even now. In the last 30 years, it should be pointed out, some militant elements of Ukrainian politics actively embraced the legacy of certain war heroes affiliated, unfortunately, with the Nazi occupation, particularly Stepan Bandera, who was an anti-Semite committed to helping the Nazis during the Holocaust. Even though only a small fraction of Ukrainians today view Bandera as a hero, and a posthumous award he had been given in 2010 was in fact taken away a few years later by the Ukrainian parliament, it is, needless to say, in Putin's interest to burnish this aspect of Soviet history when he makes his grossly exaggerated claim that Ukraine is in any sense today a fascist state. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Next we have Eli.
Slava Ukraina. Heroyam Slava. This refrain is a commonplace in Ukraine, and it literally translates to glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. The national salute in Ukraine, and I open my remarks with it today, in solidarity with the brave women and men fighting for their country, fighting for democracy, and fighting an unjust, unprovoked attempt at tyrannical regime change. The events over the past week are not the outbreak of war. As Richard said, they are the continuation of an escalation of a war that has been ongoing since at least 2014. The Revolution of Dignity took place in Ukraine from February 18th, 2014 to February 23rd, 2014, when tens of thousands of Ukrainians protested to remove the corrupt and Putin-controlled government of Viktor Yanukovych from office. Putin's order to invade Ukraine and drive towards Kiev on February 24th of this year represents a clear continuation of the war. This continuation, however, has evolved into total war over an entire territory of Ukraine, not just pro-Russian separatist revolt in specific territories such as Donetsk and Lugansk, but also, as was in the previous iteration of the war. It is also impossible to know fully what Putin is thinking of, but it is clear by his actions towards Ukraine and his drive to establish a European, and Ukraine's drive to establish itself as a European democracy, that such a course is unacceptable to Putin, both to him and his interests. What is known is his geopolitical posturing and rhetoric aimed at Western intervention in pro-democratic revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and Belarus. Earlier this year, the makings of a similar revolution were underway in Kazakhstan before a Russian-led force of military units were sent in to use lethal ammunition to put down peaceful protesters. Such an intervention in suppressing popular protest against corruption and autocracy in post-Soviet states is not a novel tactic for Putin. The Euromaidan revolution occurred in Ukraine when Yanukovych backed out of an agreement to bring Ukraine closer to Europe in favor of strengthening economic ties with Russia. As thousands of protesters amassed in town centers across the country, the security services of Ukraine and the National Police Force engaged in counter-protest activities, monitoring the protesters from within, and as the protests grew, escalating their intervention into sabotage and then outright violence. Russian intelligence agents embedded within the SBU, the security services, provoked this violence in an attempt to provoke Ukraine's national police to end the protests at all costs. Russia likely had operatives on the ground in Ukraine for the past year, preparing for this invasion. Many of them were and continue to be rooted out by the current personnel of the SBU, which has likely led to the diminishing returns Russia has seen in its initial attempts to quickly capture Kiev. But these intelligence successes are not enough to prevent an overwhelming force of Russian invaders. Furthermore, regarding the strong Ukrainian defenses witnessed thus far, one needs to acknowledge that the people of Ukraine have had war more or less normalized for them in the past 8 years. Seeing columns of artillery, tanks, armored vehicles, and troop carriers rolling down city streets is not only out of the norm, is not out of the norm, but what is different about these columns is that instead of deploying to the front lines in Donbass or returning from Donbass, they're moving to defend the cities themselves. Even more of a break from normality is the appearance of Russian military columns and the necessity to sleep and seek shelter in bunkers and metro stations amidst constant bombardment from artillery and air assaults against metropolitan centers. Ukrainian military and civil defense forces have shown the ability to surprise and overwhelm many of the Ukrainian troops at the onset of the invasion. Furthermore, the improved anti-tank and anti-aircraft capabilities of the United States and NATO forces have provided over the past several years has likely surpassed the expectations of Russian commanders. It does not seem like many of the Russian forces were prepared for such a violent confrontation. Russian military units are abandoning their armored vehicles, and some of them are surrendering without a fight. Part of the demoralization of Russian troops is the misinformation that Putin's close circle of elites has disseminated to the Russian people, cultivating misperceptions about the level of unity amongst the Ukrainian people against the prospects of a Russian invasion. Right now, we're seeing Ukrainian politicians who were vehemently opposed to one another in the past 5 years, united, going out and fighting on the streets with their people to defend the cities. Terming the military presence as peacekeepers, President Putin has potentially misguided the commanders of some of his Russian personnel engaged in the fighting. Some of them even thought they were being deployed solely for the purpose of engaging in military exercises. As the ground war remains neutral, Ukrainian forces have been doing an excellent job thus far of repelling or preventing the capture of many of Ukraine's key metropolitan areas. The ability of Russian forces to launch missile attacks and air assaults has proven difficult for the Ukrainian forces to withstand. Furthermore, the recent escalation of indiscriminate ranged attacks has led to increased civilian casualties. But still, the brave people of Ukraine challenge their occupiers, and videos abound of average citizens attempting to halt armored divisions with only their arms. Tonight, as the U.S. awaits President Biden's first State of the Union address, the people of Kiev prepare for an onslaught by a 40-mile-long column of Russian forces bearing down on the capital. The Russian state media has warned Kievan citizens to flee, indicating that the planned assault on the city will likely involve more indiscriminate bombardment. Latest reports indicate that the convoy has stalled, but for how long? Still, the people of Ukraine fight on and resist. I'm hoping that in the question and answers, I can answer any questions anyone has about the military incursion going on now.
Okay, thank you very much. And over to Gabriella.
Hello. I hope you can hear me now. So in order to understand the Ukrainian situation, it is important to have a certain level of understanding of one, the European Union, what it is, and the history a little bit, the history of Eastern enlargement, and that was preceded by the Cold War 1.0. And number three, the significance of the transatlantic relationship, and by that I mean, we mean the EU-US or US-EU relations. You probably heard it in the news that to the plea of President Zelensky, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, is the EU's, the European Union's bureaucratic executive arm, actually. So the president of the European Commission that promotes the common interest of the European Union said Sunday, February 27th, Ukraine belongs in the European Union and the bloc wants the country to join. But this will not be a quick move, as we all know, because an accession process has not been, well, it actually has been initiated right now, but there hasn't been an accession process and negotiations with the Ukraine previously, and negotiations typically take place over several years. But it is a huge deal. So what I'm trying to ask you is this a huge deal? Why would Ukraine want to join the European Union? Why would the European Union want the Ukraine join? Who would like to support, or who wants to support this? Certainly not Mr. Putin. The EU is a big deal. Belonging to the EU is a big deal. I can't emphasize that enough. It's not only an economic powerhouse and a political powerhouse to reckon with, but it also has by now a legacy of 70 years of peace. 70 years of peace. I can't emphasize that enough. So if you belong to the European Union, that means that war is unimaginable and literally impossible, pretty much, among member states. And that, considering the fact that how, throughout history, all these European powers were waging wars against one another constantly. It's a big deal. And this Franco-German friendship that we experienced today was unimaginable in the past. So European integration and its contribution to peace and democracy cannot be overemphasized. That's what I wanted to start with. But with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for the first time since World War II, the security of Europe is tested in unprecedented ways. So you should worry about it because the current order is tested in many different ways. I wanted to go back real quick to after World War II, the devastation of World War II that Richard was referencing as well. There were three critical needs for Europe that are still true today. And one, to rebuild weakened economies. And the US's Marshall Plan, that was an extensive economic aid to Western Europe that helped to rebuild Europe and rebuild the partnership. Pretty much the United States has always played a critical role in the process of European integration, both intentionally and unintentionally. So that was the first goal, a critical need. Second one, to ensure security from one another and external threats. That was the goal back then. That's the goal still today. And the integration of the currently 27 member states and shared ideals, such as the requirement by the Copenhagen conditions that once you're a member state, you want to be a member state, you have to show that you're building a democratic system. You are a democracy, you have democratic institutions, and you're building a market economy, underscore that. And so that helped with the former to kind of hold them as a glue together. And NATO membership for these members also fills the role from this outside threat. As we speak, the Finnish parliament, actually, I think the vote is going to be tomorrow by Finland to join, because some countries are not NATO members currently, but they are debating that, and the support just skyrocketed for that. And So number three, to limit the dangers of nationalism, nationalist extremism was the third need, and that unfortunately is as valid today as it was after Second World War. Well, not as much, but it's still relevant considering that we are currently living through an unprecedented 15 years of democratic backsliding or democratic decline. That hasn't really happened before. And so, and also the rise of populism and extremism and pretty much all over the world. So that's that, why it's important for the Ukraine and to feel like they belong to this bloc. Before actually the 2014 takeover of Crimea by Russia, Kiev was trying to sign a deal with Brussels, and then look what happened. Now, my second point about Central and Eastern Europe, that was part of the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. These countries were really keen on moving out of Moscow's orbit or Moscow's influence. If you think about the 1956 revolution in my own birth country, Hungary, or the 1968 revolution against the Soviets by Czechoslovakia, you can see that as an important point. So Eastern enlargement, taking in 8 former Central Eastern European countries into the European Union in 2004, was also a big deal, not just for these countries that wanted to do that, but also for the European Union and European politics and European security. And so pretty much these new rounds of negotiations in 2004 made the EU 28 and 27 and were politically significant, and they marked the final end of the Cold War division of Europe, Cold War 1.0, and the transformation of much of the Soviet bloc states from communism to liberal democracy, pretty much. Last but not least, I wanted to go to the third idea. Well, the transatlantic partnership matters for many reasons, as I mentioned. The problem was after 2004 that there was this assumption that the expansion of NATO and the EU made the Central Eastern European states uninteresting and unimportant in a sense. They were okay. In fact, I used to say back in the day that, well, my area of expertise is kind of boring. Who wants to study European politics? It's boringly fine. It's peaceful, right? Not so much right now. So with the end of the Cold War, having removed much of the glue that held the US and Europe together, and also held by the controversy over Iraq, revealed a new willingness by the EU to assert itself. And the US and even the EU itself perhaps did not really realize the fragility of the region of Central and Eastern Europe. And by extension, I would include Ukraine as well. So pretty much what has been happening, even though in 2009, there were warnings about Russia's increased economic activity in these regions, and this idea of new generation warfare, which refers to the idea of breaking the internal coherence of the enemy system and not about integral annihilation based on the idea of Gerasimov doctrine, cyber warfare pretty much, was the new tactic of Vladimir Putin's. And the goal was pretty much just to restore Russia's historic sphere of influence, try to capture economically through the participating actively in the energy industry of Europe, and specifically, some of the most eastern part of Europe, and also to corrode democracy from within by deepening political divides and cultivating relationship with aspiring autocrats, political parties, nationalist populist, Eurosceptic parties. The key was to prevent the work of independent press and judiciary and spreading misinformation and propaganda. So this is what we have been in the midst of, and right now, with the crisis and taking over the Ukraine, we just experienced this emboldened behavior of Vladimir Putin. Interesting fact that I'd like to share as a last idea is that allegedly, I'm not 100% sure if it's true or not. Maybe my colleagues can confirm or not. Gerasimov, who was the author of this doctrine of this cyber warfare kind of thing, was fired by Putin.
confirmed it.
Allegedly, not confirmed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriella. So next we have Andrew Barnes.
I'm going to look at the people in the back of the room. Do you hear me when I speak? Hey, look at that. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and for those of you who are joining us remotely, I appreciate your attendance. It certainly speaks to the gravity of the situation. Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences for setting up the event, recognizing it was important to do for the community. I'm going to spend my first minute or so making 3 general points, and then I'll spend 4 or 5 minutes talking about the Ukrainian and global response to the invasion so far. Like the other panelists, I'm happy to answer questions when the time comes. So the first point to make is that this is an unprovoked war of choice. This is not a question of last resort. There was no imminent threat to Russia. There was no raging humanitarian crisis to stop or anything like that. This is a direct invasion by an external power. Second, while it hasn't gone as well for Putin and his government as they probably expected, nonetheless, it's causing terrible human suffering. There's been the intentional, probably, and certainly the accidental killing of civilians. Well over 600,000 refugees have escaped the country, with many, many more on their way. People who've remained in the country are spending their time in shelters where their food and water are running out, and so on. In addition, the war is less than a week old. So while, again, the beginning may not have gone the way its planners had hoped, Russia can continue to turn up the military pressure, as it's already doing. And the third point I'd like to make is to remember that we're living in a community, both Kent State specifically and Northeast Ohio generally, with a lot of people who have ties to the region. So I'd encourage you to support your friends and neighbors with those ties. Ask them how they're doing, ask them what you can do to help. This is an attack on a lot of things that are supposed to be good for all of us. And so I'd encourage us to use it instead in order to strengthen our bonds to each other. All right, so let's turn to some major aspects of the response to the invasion. First and foremost has been the resistance of the Ukrainians themselves, and Eli already spoke about this. They do have, it's important to know, a real military force, which is vastly outnumbered, but nonetheless a professional fighting force. And they've had widespread support from the population, some of whom are returning from abroad. These citizens are taking up arms themselves. They're supplying support for the fighters. They are trying to sabotage the Russian advance, or all of the above. Without this, none of what I'm about to talk about would really be meaningful, so I wanted to point that out first. So how about the external response? Well, so far, there has been remarkable cooperation and even unity in that response. You haven't seen a lot of dithering around, a lot of posturing, a lot of sternly worded letters or anything like that, right? There have been rapid actions that appear meaningful, and they demonstrate a willingness to suffer at least a little bit of pain at home. I'm going to point to 3 areas where this is true. First, and what I'll say the most about, are the sanctions themselves, right? In the first few days, we saw, for example, the rapid agreement by Germany to halt progress on a project called Nord Stream 2. Many of you know this, but for those who don't, this is a large pipeline for natural gas that was going to circumvent Ukraine and supply Germany and the rest of Europe with a lot of natural gas from Russia. There's been pressure on Germany to put sanctions on this for quite some time, and it didn't happen. But then when the invasion started, right away, Germany responded. In addition, multiple countries agreed rapidly to freeze assets and ban travel on wealthy individuals in Russia, folks who are close to Putin, hoping to put pressure on him. Several major Russian companies and banks were prevented from participating in the international economy in the same way that they had before. And then by the end of the first weekend, an even bigger sanction had been imposed, as several Russian banks had been kicked out of the SWIFT system, which I imagine became one of the leading search terms on Google that weekend. By now, many of you may know that SWIFT is a secure system that facilitates transfers between banks, right? So kicking banks out of it makes it a whole lot more difficult for them to make those transfers. So at this point, with many, though not all, Russian banks having been removed from it, it is now more difficult for these banks to do business either into or out of Russia. And more countries keep joining the sanctions, which have spread to banning Russian commercial flights, removing Russian teams or artists from events, and so on. There are still some exceptions to the rules. You can still do a lot to get energy in and out of Russia. European banks are still able, so far, to be repaid by Russian enterprises to whom they've lent money. So that there's still some activity going on. But these are more significant sanctions imposed more rapidly than we've seen in just about any other case, and they're already having some impact on the Russian economy, both at the elite level and at the everyday level. So that's sanctions. Let me also say a couple of words about the strengthened defense posture in Europe. Essentially what's happening is that NATO and its member countries are moving troops, as well as material, to strengthen the eastern edge of NATO. That made sense to me when I saw it happening, and I would expect it to continue as long as Russia doesn't stop the invasion. One part of this was the beginning of the deployment of the NATO Rapid Response Force. This is a force that totals about 40,000 troops, although they weren't all deployed initially, and it was designed exactly for this, to go to a crisis area on short notice to either defend the area directly or to set up to receive more troops and material if that becomes necessary. Speaking of US involvement, the US does participate, of course, in NATO and certainly has its own forces in Europe, and those too are being repositioned around the continent. Some folks have been called up from the US to head toward Europe in case they're needed. And the last point I want to raise about the external response so far is the provision of military equipment. Some materials have been provided over the last several years since the first Russian incursion in 2014, but those have been limited in important ways, and that changed quickly last week. It's still undergoing change, frankly. For example, Germany sent Stinger missiles and anti-tank weaponry, and a lot of countries have promised to provide more. The reticence to provide weaponry to Ukraine has certainly been reduced. Again, this is a change from the past, although it's far too early to know what effect it will have. So let me close by saying three things as well. First, the Ukrainian response itself has been extraordinary. The external response has been more widespread, more significant, and more rapid than a lot of people might have expected. But third, we're a long way from knowing whether the response will stop the invasion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And finally, we have Molly.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Excellent, thanks. What I'm going to talk about is the role of gender and sexuality in the invasion of Ukraine, and to provide some historical context, some framing of how gender interacts with military incursions as well as with peace. And I want to end on a note of peace and peace building. Much is being made of the women who are joining the resistance in the Ukraine. And significantly, what has been trending are photographs in both social and corporate media of very sexualized imagery of conventionally attractive women wearing outfits that are pretty well-fitting gear and not necessarily combat, rather than looking at the real women soldiers in the Ukraine army who are in their lumpy but protective combat gear. And I want to talk about the roles of women and how they are historically represented and also how they are used in propaganda. Women have fought in wars of all nations throughout history, although it has been more common for women to have roles in resistance armies, defensive armies, rather than occupying professionalized militaries. Women have also been used as propaganda in war and have disproportionately been victims of war, both as a consequence of civilian weaponry being used against them, as well as being victims of sexual assault, and a victimization that further serves purposes of propaganda through the ways, thank you. Thanks, Andrew. from the ways in which the imagery and victimization of women are further used to demonstrate the goodness or badness. I guess I can't use microphones. And genocide is significantly invoked against women. Okay. And when we look at American views of gender and war, we are a country that's very distant from war. And in fact, we have significant distortions from how we have been protected by the consequences of war. For example, in World War II, it is estimated that 15 million soldiers died, but there were at least 45 million civilian deaths directly from war, and at least another 30 million who died of disease and famine. Since 2001, estimates are that 1.3 to 2 million civilians have died of a consequence of US-led military actions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan. Women from the region of the Ukraine have participated in resistance against German occupiers as members of various partisan units, some of which also then fought against Soviet occupiers toward the end of World War II. It should be noted that resistance against Soviet control remained constant in certain pockets of Ukrainian territories, going back to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. In World War II, women were subjected to rape campaigns from both German and Soviet occupiers, and women also fully participated in the Soviet military, representing 5% of total forces. And some of the most decorated women combat soldiers, snipers, tank crews, and combat air crews actually came from the Ukraine. In the United States and elsewhere, women remain underrepresented in military careers and face significant challenges in advancing their careers. In the US, the percentage of women is 14% in the active military. Currently, women comprise 16% of the Ukraine military. And in 2018, the Ukraine adopted a law giving women equal rights to men in the military. And when we look to Russia, which I mentioned during the World War II era, women were fully involved in combat. Currently, Russian women comprise less than 10% of the overall military. I want to shift, though, attention to peace building, which is another significant role that women have had. And we know, again, that women have been involved in peace movements as far back as we have records, and long before women had legal rights. Even Aristophanes, the ancient Greek playwright, mentioned women peace activists resisting the Peloponnesian War, albeit as a comic farce, and that was in 411 BC. One of the longest standing women peace organizations is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was founded in 1915 by suffragists who shifted energies from receiving the right to vote to working to end World War I. And it should be noted that much of the impetus for many suffrage organizations in the United States and European democracies was so that women could in fact have a voice of opposing wars through the democratic process. Human rights, civil rights, and equality are connected to the democratic process. And not surprisingly, violations of human rights and oppression more commonly occur in autocratic and fascist nations. Despite the enormous consequences that war has had on women's lives and equality, it wasn't until 2000 that the landmark UN resolution on women, peace, and security passed, which affirmed the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and emphasized the importance of their equal participation and full involvement. Before the passage of the Peace and Security Act, a review of 664 peace agreements from 1990 to 2000 noted that only 11% of them included any reference to women's security and inclusion. And from 1992 to 2001, only 4% of signatories and less than 10% of negotiators were women. And so again, what we see is that women are disproportionately engaged as civilian victims in war, but not having a voice in consequences related to war and to peace. But there is good news. And the good news is that an International Peace Institute study of 182 signed peace agreements between 1989 and 2011 found that when women are included in peace processes, there was a 35% increase in the probability that a peace agreement will last 15 years or more. Evidence indicates that women participants in peace processes are less focused on the spoils of war and more on reconciliation, economic development, education, and transitional justice, all elements of sustained peace. And central as well to issues of lasting peace are human rights, which includes not only women's rights, but LGBTQ rights. These rights connect to the United Nations principles and also to membership in the European Union. The late 20th century and early 21st century have seen significant improvements in the rights of women and LGBTQ people. But as more European nations have embraced human rights and democratic ideals, Russia has increasingly pushed back. In 2017, Putin signed a bill that decriminalized domestic violence in Russia. We also have seen a systematic pattern of denying women's rights, including pushback against economic equality, violence against women, increased restrictions against reproductive choice, and other patterns of oppression coinciding with Putin's rule. In terms of LGBTQ rights, even as the rest of Europe, including other Eastern European nations like the Ukraine, have increased LGBT+ rights, Russia has systematically pushed against them. Certainly, the Ukraine needs to improve its record of LGBTQ rights. It ranks 36 out of 49 European nations. However, it is moving towards improved equality from legislative and sociocultural perspectives. In Putin's Russia, LGBTQ people have been facing increased oppression. Hate crimes are on the rise, and the so-called anti-propaganda laws have been enacted to criminalize public demonstration and publications from LGBTQ organizations. And in fact, last week, Russia attempted to end the ability of LGBTQ organizations to offer services to people. We also have seen in the Ukraine, for example, the group Insight has been working to relocate LGBTQ people away from invasion sites, particularly because they have information that LGBTQ people are going to be targeted by Russian-backed paramilitary organizations. Now, today there was the Russian-backed Chechen general who was killed in a battle in the Ukraine, and he is the person, and his unit has actually been engaged in purges, in other words, genocide against LGBTQ people in Chechnya. And so I want to conclude by saying that it is important that human rights, reconciliation, economic development, education, and transitional justice be on the negotiating table. And one way to ensure that is to ensure that Ukrainian women and other minorities are included by the United Nations and other peace brokers to be voices in the peace process and at the table. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Molly. I would just like to say that I think the depth and the kind of breadth of the presentations that we've had today is a testament to the expertise that resides in the College of Arts and Sciences here. The fact that we've been able to assemble a panel like this with such detailed expert knowledge across a whole range of the questions that are raised by Ukraine. Says something about the kind of quality of the academics that we have here in the College of Arts and Sciences. I think we've still got an opportunity for questions and answers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about 3 or 4 questions straight up, and then I'll kind of hand them over to the panel. I think we've got some questions on Zoom. Tony?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we have a lot of guests joining us. We have about 277 people joining us through Zoom. Lots of questions, and maybe I'll just ask sort of a summary question. A major theme on the chat board here is people concerned about escalation and questions about NATO and why doesn't NATO just go into Ukraine? But an overall concern is the odds and the chances of escalation up to the point of nuclear war.
Okay, and questions from the floor? Over here.
Hi, my name is Zach. I am a master's student here for Russian translation. I lived 4 years in Kiev and 2 years in Rostov-on-Don near the Ukrainian border. I guess my question is, as a friend, I worked in Ukrainian media circles. I have a lot of academic friends, and I don't think this will de-escalate anytime soon, and there are already hundreds of thousands of refugees. I guess my question is, as a university, as academics in peace and conflict studies, what can we do to support Ukrainian academics? Are there ideas or programs or funding that we can apply to in unison? I think unison has been shown to be a key role in this in terms of the US and our allies. I hope that academia can also be unified in our response. Is there anything we can do to bring Ukrainian academics here, provide them with full funding, provide them with housing, and able to continue their work, whether it's in astrophysics or it's in LGBT studies in Ukraine? That's my question from college to the College of Arts and Sciences.
Thank you very much. A couple more questions. This gentleman here, maybe. Thank you.
Well, I would just like to ask. Okay, all right. Sorry, this was like my first time doing this kind of stuff. Okay, the whole this. I'm going to preface this with this. This whole war is criminal, but I feel like.
Okay, if you can find another person.
Sorry, Scott.
Hello, is it working? Yeah. So my name is Austin. I graduated in December with a degree in global studies and minors in. Hello? Okay. And my question is, so I was discussing the invasion of Ukraine with some of my friends in Russia, and most of them do not support the invasion, but one of them claimed that it was necessary because of, quote, aggressive NATO expansion, and that it's because NATO broke its promises not to expand eastward. I'm curious what you would have to say about these accusations.
Okay, maybe one final question, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Did mention I would give him
I just like to talk about kind of the double standards of the like CNN and all that, like the reporting of this. I mean, oh geez. Okay. So like Condoleezza. Oh. Yes, I have a quick question. Okay, so why is Russia being taken off SWIFT for a criminal war, but why hasn't America been taken off SWIFT for its equally criminal war in Iraq, in Afghanistan? And why aren't people putting flags of this is more like I just feel like more whatever.
So I think we got the kind of gist of the question, that the concerns about double standards and hypocrisy. So I guess that would be one question. But got the question about concerns about escalation. What can we do to support Ukrainian academics, and what's the response to this narrative that the war is at least in part a response to NATO expansion? So I don't know who wants to go first. necessarily to each and every one of those questions. You might want to kind of select one that you want to respond to.
I think we can both do the
Go ahead.
the escalation one.
Do whatever.
So a lot of people were concerned when President Putin came out with a statement announcing the escalation of his nuclear deterrence force to an elevated status. Just like the United States, the Russian Federation has a level of readiness when it comes to deploying its nuclear forces. Here we call it DEFCON. It's not an official term, but the most common used term. And essentially, the actions taken by President Putin are not unprecedented. The level that he raised the readiness to was raised there in 2014 during the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of, or the escalation of the Donbass separatist conflict. It was raised in 2008 when Russia engaged in warfare with Georgia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia. What was unprecedented by his statement was that it was not coordinated in advance with the United States and other nuclear powers. Normally, the procedure would be, it wouldn't come as a shock. The United States would anticipate it. And so by him saber rattling this nuclear threat, it was likely, not likely, but it was possibly provoked by his shock at how the war efforts in Ukraine was not going as well as he had planned. And so it could be an immediate response. But needless to say that as of yet, there hasn't been at least confirmed evidence of any behavior of escalation leading towards breaking of protocol regarding nuclear readiness for all countries.
Right. So I can not speak to that now. Perfect. Thank you. Thanks. But there were several other questions. One is about the refugee crisis, in particular, academics. There are a number of academic groups that are working in that direction. I may be able to post links after the event. I don't know what Kent's response is yet, or the College of Arts and Sciences, but that's clearly something we should think about. It's got layers to it, as everything does. For one thing, most refugees of conflicts would rather stay closer to home than further from home. So on that score, it's better to be in Poland than in New York or Cleveland or whatever, because you want to go home when it's safe to do so. Another thing that people have pointed out is that splitting up academics and spreading them all around the world ruins academic communities. So if people can be intentional about it and lift an entire department, if they have the resources to do that, then that could be a very useful thing to do. And another point to make, of course, is that many of them are involved in the conflict right now, right? And men between 18 and 60 are not supposed to leave the country. So that will have an impact on who can come, which is something that would have to be worked out. But the idea of the willpower and the desire to help, it certainly exists. And I agree with you, or at least your implication, that it'll be good to see Kent be involved in that to the extent that it can be. As for the NATO expansion argument, I put that in the same category as the other arguments that Putin has used, which is that they sometimes have a kernel of truth, but are not sufficient to explain the war. Russia's been opposed to the expansion of the EU and NATO from the get-go. That's absolutely true. NATO has done its best, or at least it's very good, to make itself look like a non-threat. And it certainly hasn't taken an aggressive military posture towards Russia. Ironically for Putin, who I do think has a larger geopolitical goal of weakening the Western alliances, he's probably done more than anybody to strengthen them in the last week than anyone could have imagined 2 weeks ago, right? Now we've got Finland trying to get into NATO. In a lot of ways, Ukraine, although it will take a long time, is probably closer to EU and NATO membership than they were 2 weeks ago. So it was an issue that was on the table between the West and Russia, certainly. But to provoke a full-on invasion, no. And then to the last question that was asked, I encourage people to think about other cases and why they may have gone differently, and that's fine. But to get very involved in that sort of thinking is to take us down the road of what people call whataboutism, which, whether the person doing it intends to or not, ends up distracting from the issue at hand. And I've seen this when I go into spaces and start talking about, well, there might be an issue of sexism here. And somebody says, well, yeah, but what about the race question? Which is fine. I'm all about resolving race issues as well. But nobody raises it in order to solve both sexism and racism. Instead, they raise racism to stop you from talking about sexism, or they raise sexism to stop you from talking about racism. And so no matter what else has gone on, whatever wrong was done before by whoever, the issue facing us now is an invasion of Russia by Russia into Ukraine. And until that gets resolved, talking about these other issues is not going to resolve that particular question.
Okay, anybody else who's not spoken wants to?
I just wanted to, just one sentence to confirm or affirm that Andrew was saying about, NATO making promises. It's more Vladimir Putin's wishful thinking, and yes, at some point maybe it was on the table, but there were never really specific promises made by NATO. That's not true.
Okay, I think we've got time for at least another round of questions. Can we take another one from the Zoom audience?
One question that came up on the chat, which I think is easy, is there's a request for a follow-up forum like this in the coming weeks, and I think that's something that we're very much interested in doing. So I'll take a question from the audience.
Can you hear me? My name is Patrick. I teach in the Department of Modern and Classical Language Studies, and the first thing I would like to do is express my solidarity with the people of Ukraine who are fighting against this invasion. And I also like to express my solidarity with the very, very brave people who are protesting in Russia against this invasion, against odds and against dangers that we don't have to see when we protest war in this country. I kind of disagree, Andrew, with the putting these things aside and addressing the issue at hand, because I think that when you talk about this invasion is unprovoked, as Richard did at the beginning of the discussion, I think that's absolutely true. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be asking the questions about what the overall political context of this is. And there are several reasons for doing that. One, the US, at least in my opinion, as an anti-imperialist, I don't think the US has the answer to this question. I think people have the answer to this question in Russia, in the Ukraine, and in the United States. There's going to be a lot of pressure, even amongst progressives, to say we have to do something. We have to intervene as a country to stop this. But the United States doesn't go to Iraq in order to protect our Iraqis, or Afghanistan to protect the Afghanistanis, or something closer to my area of studies, Latin America, where we can list country after country after country that the US has invaded only with the interest of the United States in mind. So I think it's fair to ask about NATO, which very much purposefully expanded, even though when there was a promise that there wouldn't be any more need for NATO after the end of the Cold War. NATO was used as an excuse to go into countries that aren't even in Europe. And it is basically the United States' hand in European military affairs. And so I think that's something we have to address. I don't have all the answers for that, but I do think it's fair to ask that. And we can do that without somehow sounding like we're making an excuse for Putin. That is far, far from, I think, the case. The last thing I would like to say is I think that escalation would be hugely dangerous, and US intervention militarily would be a very, very big mistake, because as I can't remember now who mentioned it from the panel, said that Ukrainians who nobody ever expected would be fighting on the same side are fighting on the same side against the Russian invasion. If the United States intervenes, if NATO intervenes, either with no-fly zones or otherwise militarily, what are we saying to the Russian people who are protesting against Putin right now, which is our strongest hand, I think? We're chasing those people into the hands of Putin himself. So I think we should organize anti-war movement here at Kent State, here in the United States, in solidarity with Ukraine and Russian people who are against Putin.
Okay, maybe one more question and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you so much. My Jameson, I'm a student of physics and political science. My question is kind of two-pronged, but it has to do with the Budapest Memorandum, where the US and other major powers guaranteed security assurances to the Ukraine in exchange for non-proliferation. My two questions really are, one, would the Ukraine be in a better security situation with respect to Russia if they didn't take the course of non-proliferation after the Soviet Union dissipated? And two would be how does our kind of reneging of our security assurances under Budapest, how does that affect our position as a major diplomatic power, especially in the area of influence where major diplomatic issues, China and influences in the Asian sphere, how does that affect our credibility to back up minor powers when we're dealing with them? Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've got again the kind of that thematic of questions around US hypocrisy, the limits on, you know, well, what are the limits on intervention, and I guess is there a need for a sort of anti-war movement here in the US, and also the question around the Budapest Convention, which I certainly I would be able to make some comments on that if nobody else can. Does anybody want to respond to the kind of, I guess, the question around hypocrisy and the kind of questions around the limits on US intervention?
Yeah, I'll say something, and Patrick, I appreciate you haven't said this, but one hears, you know, on Twitter and other social media platforms, this question that Andrew touched on, whataboutism, and I understand your answer, Patrick, to Andrew, and how it is that people are of the assumption that somehow NATO, you know, made Putin feel this way, right? I think it's important to keep in mind, first of all, that no country is pristine, right? No, you know, good country is entirely good. No bad country entirely bad. I mean, one thing that I think we could also raise, for instance, in the question today of what's happening in Ukraine is the experience of international students from Africa, who some of you will know are not being allowed to cross the border into Poland, pretty much because of the racism of border guards who won't let them out or let them through. So that's an issue that could also be legitimately brought up, and importantly so. But when we look at the question of Putin's agenda and the presumption that, for instance, George Bush's romancing of Georgia, right, in 2008, somehow engendered Putin's response, I think we need to be very clear in reading what Putin has to say about Putin himself. We need to understand the man on his own terms, in other words. He regrets the breakaway of the constituent republics of the Soviet Union. He has said that was a mistake. The Soviet Union should never have broken up into constituent republics. He seeks a greater Russia. He seeks a return to a greater Russia in this sense. He was made president. He was elected president on free elections on the promise of destroying Chechnya, of destroying the Chechen separatists. He promised to kill them, and he did so. So, Patrick, I understand you're not denying that, but there's a way in which the kinds of sentiments that can easily be expressed about what NATO or the United States has done to put Putin in this position, I think, need to be weighed against what Putin will say and tell you about Putin himself.
Anybody else want to respond?
I can add to that too. Those of you in my politics of war class have heard this already, but I'm glad you brought up Chechnya, because this is starting to resemble Chechnya very, very much. Ironically, Chechnya and Ukraine initially separated from the Soviet Union at the exact same time. However, one was basically allowed to attempt to become an independent state, while the other was brought back in. And over about 12 years, 12 to 14 years, the onslaught in Chechnya looks very similar to what, if we add the Euromaidan and the revolution to this war, looks very similar to the type of path that Putin seems to be taking in Ukraine. And I think that it's potential that the main aims of Putin at this point might have transgressed down to allowing the conflict to engross the entire territory of Ukraine, be stalemated into constant bickering, and forestall a resolution to the conflict long enough so that different factions emerge. Those three individuals who I mentioned, three politicians in Ukraine who are united right now, this is 5 days in, 6 days in. 3 months from now, if the war is still going on, they might have factionalized at that point. And then what Putin will do is the same thing he did with Kadyrov in Chechnya, and choose what he thinks is the strongest, most allied faction, and fund them and promote them to establish a Putin-friendly regime in Ukraine, eliminating the other factions. That's one thing that I think he might be thinking, and that I think he might be aiming to do. But again, I think his miscalculation is the nationalist unity amongst the people of Ukraine. And so I think that's one thing that his miscalculations appear to be misguided. And I think a lot of it is based on his misunderstanding of history as well.
Okay, anybody else want to? I've got a couple of comments that I want to make, but anybody else?
Is that all right?
Yeah, Andrew.
Is that okay? I'm going to start with the last one because it's actually easier, right? The Budapest Memorandum, in case folks don't know, it was 1994, and it wasn't just about Ukraine agreeing to non-proliferation, but in fact, agreeing to give away the nuclear weapons that it had, right? Because the Soviet Union had, of course, a lot of nuclear weapons, and it had stationed some in Ukraine. And one of the questions for the United States, one of the main questions for the United States at the end of the Soviet Union was what's going to happen to the nuclear weapons. It was very much the United States' desire, as well as the Russian desire, that they all be concentrated in Russia, rather than having to keep track of them everywhere. And Ukraine agreed to that with the understanding that there would be some sort of security assurances, right? And that's where things get dicey, is what did that really mean on paper, and what does it mean at this point? And so, you know, you don't take these contracts to a court of law and have somebody enforce one side or the other. But the West has basically said, well, what we meant was we'll do kind of what we're doing now. We'll offer moral support. Whereas Ukraine argues that we expected much more, that we wanted to be under your nuclear umbrella so that we couldn't be threatened by Russia this way. And so that's certainly a point of contention between the Ukrainian government and most of the people in Ukraine and the governments in the West. So the question was whether they'd be better off if they hadn't given them up. In the question of whether they would have been invaded by Russia, I suspect they wouldn't have been invaded by Russia if they still had nuclear weapons, you know, at water under the bridge at this point. But it's an interesting question for a place like Pakistan or India, right? Under what circumstances should I ever give up my nuclear weapons? Look what happened to Ukraine. It actually raises issues for those sorts of questions. The effect of our bailing out on it, right? It's how it's going to be perceived from Ukraine is it damages our relationship with Ukraine. It's not like it's irreparable. But there's resentment that the West sort of left us hanging out here. I think I'll leave the other questions out there, maybe for the next event.
Okay, I've got a couple of points that I want to make as well. I mean, first of all, I think to this kind of point about NATO expansion, I think that sometimes, you know, there's that cliche that the first casualty of war is the truth, but I think that if that's the case, the second one is often nuance. And I think it's possible to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. I do think there were policy mistakes made at the end of the Cold War. I think there was a real opportunity. The Warsaw Pact dissolved, and there was a real opportunity to mirror that with the dissolution of NATO. And that would have been, I think, a really significant and an important move in terms of, you know, fostering a different kind of security architecture in Europe. And I think related to that as well is the idea that we know that sort of shame and humiliation is often a driver for violence and aggression, both at the individual level and at the kind of nation state level as well. So on the one hand, I think we do need to recognize that and acknowledge that, but that doesn't, as others have said, I don't think it necessarily excuses or represents an apology for what Putin has done. Also, I think as well, linked to that, the kind of security issue is that I don't think this is just one of the factors that makes this, what's happening in the Ukraine, of real concern, is that we've seen growing militarization around the world over the last few decades or so. We've squandered the opportunity for a post-Cold War dividend, and as you can see now from this graphic here, global military expenditure is now at its highest level in real terms since the late 1980s. If we kind of move on to the next slide, you can see here as well that again, looking from Moscow, what Putin sees is a NATO alliance which is led by the USA, which accounts for 39% of global military expenditure, and a NATO alliance that accounts for about 55% of global military expenditure, compared with Russia's 3.1%. So, in terms of the discussion of the kind of force ratios and everything, the force that NATO has at its hands are considerably more effective, more well-funded, and more well-equipped than those of the Russians. If I kind of move on to the next one, move on to the next one as well, and the next one. Yeah, so the other point I want to make about the Budapest Memorandum, which you can see is at the bottom here of this slide, so thank you for, you kind of like delivered on my kind of pre-work for this session. But that comes in a context as well, because the other worrying context in which the events that we're seeing pan out in Ukraine is happening is the kind of erosion of a whole series of post-Cold War arms control agreements. I mean, they're all listed there, so I won't go through them, but if you can see the text, and there's kind of one arms control agreement after another arms control agreement after another one that has ended either because the Russians have kind of ended it, or because the Americans have ended it, or some combination of the two together. And the only one really kind of now standing up of significance is the New START agreement, which was extended to 2026 by the Biden administration. But for the last sort of several years, we've been experiencing a crisis of arms control. And that's kind of, and one of the benefits of the arms control processes in the Cold War, and this is my final point, was not so much the substantive kind of reductions in armaments that they brought about. They didn't really bring about that many significant reductions. But the fact that there was an ongoing process of dialogue and communication that went on almost, almost continuously from the 1960s onwards through to the end of the Cold War. There was a brief hiatus in the early 80s, but apart from that, there was a process of continuous dialogue and communication between, Cold War enemies. And I think some of that has been kind of lost with the crisis of arms control that we've seen. So, have we got time for one round, or are we up on time? Sorry? Oh, right. Okay. So that's it. We're finished. Yep. Okay. Well, I guess it's all that's left to me to say. First of all, is a couple of points. Before I'm going to thank the panel in a second, but before I do that, I would also like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for supporting this event at such short notice, and particularly thanks to Sandra Morgan, Stephanie Snyder, and Josh Talbot from Arts and Sciences, and also Ryan Rowland from University Events. And finally, well, penultimately, I would like to thank you all for the brilliant questions that we've had, both from you and from the Zoom audience. And finally, I'd like to thank the panel for their really brilliant contributions that they've made, and I think they've helped to educate us a little more on the events of the last few weeks, months, and indeed years. So I would like to, if we could just thank them in the normal way. And also, I think there was finally one question about will there be a follow-on event? We are giving very active thought to that and discussing the potentials for that. So look out for information on that. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll try and find out what that is and try and publicize it.